I live in the Chicago area. My wife is not necessarily thrilled that I come to Florida as often as I do, but the last time I think I was with this group was in Marco Island, maybe a couple of years ago, William, not this past summer, but the summer before.
Yep. And Blaine, you are being streamed live, so be aware.
Yep.
I just like to let people know that.
Check the zipper, everything.
Well, the other thing is Blaine has given me permission to record him, so we will record his presentation as well.
You know, I joke about the zipper thing. I've been speaking to groups formally for at least 15 to 20 years now, and there have been probably 2 occasions where I've come back from a bathroom break and my fly was open and nobody said anything. And I'm the one that discovers it. And you know, talk about getting off your train of thought when you're, it's like, oh, there was a breeze. I wonder how, and then what do I do about it? Do we take a break? I know we just came back from a break, but let's just take a quick break, or do I just talk to you like this? Or fortunately, it's only happened a couple of times, but it's pretty humbling. So the thing that I love about what I'm here to talk to you about is that communication skills is a universal skill, if you will. I mean, there are so many ways that you can use the information that I'm going to talk to you about today. So it not only has a broad application, and it's needed. I mean, I think in today's age, especially in our multitasking, high-tech, smartphone era that we're in, we're getting a little rusty on some of the ways that we actually used to connect with one another. You know, we're more connected in some respects than we've ever been before, and you could also argue that we're less connected with each other than we've ever been before. So not only is this a skill that is needed, but I believe it's one that you can always improve on. I don't think we ever reach the top of communication skills. I mean, I never feel as if I can't get any better at this. And I fail all the time, you know, whether it be trying to get, you know, into my kid's head, or trying to resolve an issue with my spouse, or certainly the multitude of work challenges that we deal with on a daily basis. You know, there are many times when I realize I could have handled that better. I could have said that better, or I could have been clearer, or I could have been more authentic in the way that I was presenting my ideas. So you never get there, and that's okay, because improvement is all that we need to do. If we just keep making small progress over time, we get better and better and better. Now, as far as presentation skills goes, I mean, there is an enormous amount of information out there, and speakers and presenters who say that they are presentation skills gurus, who will be happy to, for a fee, tell you how to be a better communicator. There's no shortage of information. In fact, I think we're drowning in information. However, I think we're starving for wisdom. And I'm not here to say that I'm going to give you wisdom. I don't proclaim to have wisdom. But I am going to share with you my experiences. And I think you'll find that I'm going to approach this topic in a very different way. I'm not going to tell you exactly how you should do something, or what you do about gesturing, or how you present yourself effectively at a board meeting, or I'm going to come at this from a completely different perspective that I think you'll find refreshing. Now, I didn't intentionally. I'm a trainer at heart, and so I normally like to have handouts and stuff that people can write down and stay engaged. And for this topic, I intentionally did not do that for 2 reasons. One, I just want you to sit back and relax. I want you to just not worry about, where's the ad in the handout, and do I have to write something down, and just relax. Now, I do encourage you, however, to write some stuff down, because you're probably going to hear some things that you won't want to forget, and you will forget them if you don't write them down. So however you want to do that, I'm just kind of leaving that completely up to you. Here is my premise. This quote from George Bernard Shaw. You've probably heard it or some version of it before. I think we feel that communication is taking place when it really isn't. Now, there's a lot of challenges to why that is. We recently moved. We've been in our home, my wife and I and our children, for 25 years. This is where our kids grew up, and we finally made this big decision to move. And we didn't actually move that far away from where we lived, but we moved to kind of a different suburban area of Chicago that I was a little unfamiliar with. So as I'm venturing out and learning the new area, I was coming home one morning from the gym. And I'm driving in this area that I'm not that familiar with, and I'm approaching a stoplight. And as I'm approaching the stoplight, there's a sign, and I was able to kind of take a very quick picture of the sign. I didn't actually do it that day. I did it on another day. So the picture's a little bit blurry. I don't recommend taking a picture while you're driving, but I did that. And I'm approaching the stoplight, and here's this sign. Now I realize that signs have limited real estate. There's only so much space, and so whoever designs these things has to probably be very intentional about what words do we choose to put on a sign so that it's crystal clear to everybody that sees it what that's supposed to mean. Now, maybe it's me, but this wasn't crystal clear, right? Now, the default law in Illinois, I believe, is the same as it is in Florida, which is that unless there's a sign that says otherwise, you can turn on red, you can make a right turn on red if you come to a complete stop and it's safe to do so, et cetera, right? Now, sometimes there'll be a sign that'll say no turn on red, right? So I'm not sure what this means, right? Now, I'm the first person at the intersection. It's a red light. I'm going to be turning right. I'm not moving. I am not moving, right? Now, the people behind me are telling me what the sign means, right? I can tell by the horns and the gestures that I'm supposed to move, but I'm not going to, right? I've been down this road before making mistakes while driving that are costly, right? So I'm not moving. So I waited until the light turned green, much to the dismay of all the people behind me. And then I went on my way. Well, when I got home, I'm a curious person, and so I decided I'm going to find out what that sign means. Is it just me? So I called the town, called the police department of the town, and said, I was at this intersection, and there was this sign. And the first thing that the woman tells me is, oh, that shouldn't be there anymore. Okay, well, it is, and it's confusing. So, here are some choices. I don't know what you think that sign means. But I have some choices here as to what maybe that sign means. So does it, for instance, mean that a right turn on red is not permitted? Or does it mean that a right turn on red is permitted after stopping? In other words, the default law. Not sure why you need a sign for that, if that's the law, but okay. Does it mean that the right turn would be captured by a red light camera? Do you guys have red light cameras in Florida? Okay. I hate those things. Does it mean that you must turn on red if it's safe to do so, which is what the people behind me were telling me, right? Or some other variation, right? What do you guys think?
D.
Shout out a letter. D?
D.
D? A lot of
I
Ds?
think that's what they've been to say, but yes.
That would be my argument in court.
Okay. So the woman tells me that not only was the sign not supposed to be there, and I'm thinking, how hard would it have been to just come with like a black trash bag and just cover the thing up? Take it down would be great, but just cover the thing up. Anyway, so the sign's not supposed to be there. There used to be, apparently, at that intersection, a red light camera. That still doesn't help me. Exactly, right? And what she basically said was that it's no different than what the default law is. So there was communication that was assumed to be taking place here that really wasn't, right? In my mind, this is a really good example of poor communication. And as I mentioned, this kind of miscommunication can be costly, right? We've all probably experienced the cost of not understanding maybe exactly what a sign or a signal meant, or a law for that matter. And I'm going to go on to say that casual communication can actually cause casualties. In other words, this is not something to be casual about. Yes, I speak professionally, and this is what I do, and so I'm very interested in always finding out how to be better. But all of us, I think, should take this seriously. The communication has so many consequences. And you might remember Rick Perry back in the last presidential campaign at one of the Republican debates, who could not remember, I believe it was like the 3 departments of government that he had said that he would close down if he was elected president. And when he was asked that question, he literally could not remember what they were, and he stumbled and he stammered, and he ultimately just kind of said, oops, on stage. And it completely lost any credibility that he might have had. Now, he tried to kind of shake it off and be funny about it. And personally, that's not the kind of thing that I'm going to look at and go, oh, well, I'm not voting for him. He couldn't remember something. But it did have an effect on how people perceived him in that election cycle because of his being too casual with his communication. So I do think that there's a potential consequence to not take this seriously. Now, I like to give people at the very beginning kind of the Reader's Digest version of where we're headed. You know, in case anybody has to leave early, here's my most important point, perhaps, which is kind of like the one thing. What's the one thing that I would ask you to consider as it relates to better communication? And it would simply be to think before you speak, before you click send, before you compose the text, before you have that interaction with your teenager in their room. You know, whatever the situation might be, to simply pause a moment and think before you do it. It sounds so basic, right? You know, some of you earlier were talking about these stressful situations at work, and you know, what was the advice that we used to be given about those kind of things, right? Count to 10, something to that effect, right? In other words, wait, don't charge in right away with the emotions high, just give yourself a moment to kind of collect yourself. Well, we send out communication or speak all the time without giving a whole lot of thought to it. And I think that's actually one of the biggest things that we need to be mindful of, is thinking before we speak. Now, there is something that is kind of hindering our ability to do that. And I don't know if you've ever seen this word before. It's not procrastination, it's precrastination. It is actually a word. This comes before procrastination. Precrastination is that sense that you've got to handle something the moment it comes across your desk. And boy, is our society all about that right now, right? That email comes in, you feel like you have to address it right now. I was in the middle of something else, but ooh, an email came in. What's that, right? It's like this shiny light thing, right? I have disabled all notifications of any kind on my computer and my phone. I don't want to hear it. I don't want to have a little bubble come up to tell me it's there. When I'm ready to look to see if I have an email, I'm going to look to see if I have an email. Because what was happening was I'm busy working, ding. Oh, what's that? And now I'm off on this rabbit trail, and then by the time I finish that, I'm getting back to my other thing, which I have to kind of collect myself again and get back to that, and it ding. Okay, so I'm not here to talk about time management and how you should be doing your work, but this is one of the things that stops us from being able to just pause and think and be considerate about what we're going to be putting out there in the way of communication because of this desire, oh, I have to address that right now. I have to respond to this right now. I have to get back to this person right now. I have to get back to this employee right now. Sometimes it is right now, but many times it probably isn't quite right now, right? Quickly, but not necessarily right now. So I think that that's actually hindering us. Now I have kind of a model of communication. And as I speak about communication, I want you to realize I'm really not just speaking about speaking, right? That's a lot of our communication, but we do a lot of writing in all of its various forms. And I don't know how many people consider listening a communication skill, but I would say that's actually a very important communication skill. And what goes along with listening, I didn't put it on the graph here, would be asking good questions. Right? So questioning is actually a communication skill. That probably is more speaking than anything, but it kind of goes along with listening, right? Listening and questioning. But look at what I've got in the middle, right? That it's all about thinking first. So naturally, you know, if this is my model, I would be very intrigued by an event called the Great American Think-Off. All right, here's what it says. A competition that brings philosophy down from the ivory towers of academia and into the minds of thinking Americans. I first heard about this event in 2005. This is actually the flyer from that year. Most people have never heard of the Great American Think-Off. It takes place every year in New York Mills, Minnesota. Rural northern Minnesota, the last place on the planet that you would think that something like this would take place. I mean, C-SPAN has been there to film this event occasionally when the topic of the year has been kind of politically charged. And so every year, basically, this think-off group puts a question out to the nation. And this particular year, it was, which benefits society more, competition or cooperation? So I heard about this event because I'd read some author's biography, and he said he was a finalist in this event, and I thought, what's that? And I went to the web, and I looked it up, and I went to their website, and I saw that that was the question. And I was intrigued by just the question itself, because I have a tendency with questions like that to say, well, let's vote. Or there's times when cooperation is more beneficial, and there's times when competition is more beneficial. But see, that's not the question. The question is, what benefits society more? one or the other. And what they invite people to do is to, if you want to join the event, so to speak, is to weigh in on a side by writing an essay. Writing an essay. Well, you can only write 750 words. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with writing, but 750 words is actually not very much. If you're trying to make a compelling case and argument, have a position on something, I mean, heck, some people's emails are longer than 750 words, right? So, wow, that's a challenge to try to come up with something concise to say in 750 words or less. I just was intrigued by that challenge. And I decided to play with the question, bat it back and forth in my head. What do I really think? Is it cooperation or is it competition? All right, so I'm going to kind of use this event as a backdrop as I go through a lot of my points today, because it had a great and profound effect, not only on me personally, but it's probably been the single thing I've done personally that's had the greatest benefit to me professionally. All right, so I want you to, if nothing else, know about that event a little bit and maybe even pique your curiosity, and maybe some of you will check it out next year. It's in January that they put the question out. And by the middle of the year, the event's all over, and then we wait 6 months for another question. And that's kind of how it goes. Okay, so from my participation in that event, a formula was born. I discovered that there were kind of 3 E's to really effective communication. The first is expertise, which simply means you need to have something worthwhile to say. It all starts with, what are you going to say? And it needs to be worthwhile, because people don't have the time to hear or read or listen to anything that's not worthwhile, right? So becoming an expert in what it is that you're communicating, whatever that might be. The second E is eloquence, which is saying it well. So it's one thing to have expertise, it's another thing to actually be able to convey it. And we've seen examples, I'm sure, where a person has one but not the other. I mean, there are experts who cannot get their ideas across, right? There are experts who cannot speak with any eloquence whatsoever. And there's also people who are eloquent orators, right? And very quickly run out of things to say, right? Especially if they're speaking about something to which they're not an expert, right? Because when you're speaking about something that you're not an expert in, you don't have a whole lot to say. And then I think there's a third one, especially today, especially in today's world and with the younger demographics and their use of technology and social media. I think it's all about engagement also. Because if there isn't some way that you're engaging someone, you've lost their attention. Now there's obviously, probably dozens of ways that we could dive into all of those, but time is what it is. I'm going to just share with you what I think are some of the, at least to me, the most important considerations in each of those areas. Okay? So it's about having something worthwhile to say, saying it well, and oh, by the way, don't forget who's on the other line, right? Who's the recipient of the email? Who's on the other end of the phone? Who's the person that's across the table from me? I need to be mindful of engaging them, otherwise I'm speaking to myself. Okay, so in the think-off, in that event, you would demonstrate expertise by crafting an essay. You take a side, and in 750 words or less, you demonstrate some expertise on that topic. If you're picked as a finalist, they pick 4 people. So out of all these hundreds of essays that they get from across the country, they pick 4. They pick 2 people on one side of the question, and they pick 2 people on the other side of the question. The 4 that they felt were the most eloquent, I should say, or maybe showed the most expertise, and they bring those people on an all-expense paid trip to New York Mills, Minnesota. I got to see Fargo, I got to fly into Fargo, which I'd never been there before, which is not actually where the movie was filmed, by the way. Blaine, Minnesota, I think is where most of the movie was filmed. But flew into Fargo, and then you just drive east a little ways, and you wind up in New York Mills. I was selected as a finalist. I was selected as one of the 4. And then what happens next is those 4 people actually engage in a presidential style debate. Now, what I mean by presidential style is that there's a moderator who has questions. Begins with a question to one person, they have a certain amount of time to respond. Then the other person has a time to respond to that. And then the next person gets their question. And it's all timed and it's all very official. You make an opening statement, you make a closing statement. That's what I mean by presidential style. But ultimately, the person that gets crowned America's greatest thinker is chosen by the audience. And the audience is told, don't just vote for who you agree with. Don't vote for the person who's on your side. Vote for who makes the most compelling case. If I were to equate that to politics, we're in a political season, so I'll probably mention politics a few times today. It'd be like, don't just vote for the person who's in your party, vote for the person that you think will do the most effective job. It'd be that kind of thing, which sometimes is not easy to do, right? So this audience is charged with, don't just vote for who you like or who's on your side, but vote for who made the most compelling case. And that one person for that year will be America's greatest thinker. So this brings up the idea of, can you pick a lane? When you're thinking about what to say, what to write, what to text, how to say it, can you at least, first of all, pick a path? Now, in our business, we do it every day. It's called approve or decline, right? I mean, literally, in our industry, it's all about picking a lane. Every single loan, we have to make a decision on, yes or no. The only two choices, ultimately. But in our communication, I also think it's important to think about, am I on the fence? Am I being wishy-washy? Or have I taken a definitive stand on something? And this is my lane. So those were my two choices, right? Competition or cooperation. And I had to pick a lane. Let's talk about how you develop expertise, right? What did I know about competition and cooperation? Well, I had to do some things to become knowledgeable about competition and cooperation, right? Before I can pick a lane, I have to have some expertise, right? This was the first E, having something worthwhile to say. I've got a couple suggestions for you that are completely different from what you would normally hear people say is the way that you develop expertise. Because I don't want to tell you the obvious. The obvious is you have experience. You have your own, life experiences. You have your work experiences. We all know that that's one way to develop expertise. Another way to develop expertise is just to be a really good listener. Because there's other people out there that are experts way beyond what you'll probably ever be in certain things. And if we just paid some attention to them, we'd actually gain from their experiences, right? I like this quote from the Dalai Lama. So let's just talk about that listening thing. Again, this is kind of like a whole topic in and of itself, and you've heard many things that tell you, this is how you should be a more effective listener. I don't want to repeat the same things you already know, but I did find it interesting that listen and silent actually have all the same letters. I was like, oh, that's really interesting. You just rearrange the letters and you go from silent to listen. But 3 steps. I just sat down and thought to myself, okay, what would be like 3 critical things in today's time that could make us more effective listeners? And these are the 3 that I came up with. Obviously, paying attention, right? Focusing. We're easily distracted, and there's multiple distractions coming at us all the time. Our daughter, who is now 24, a couple of years ago, she had a big breakup. And this was going to be the one. Probably. I mean, we were already assuming that this young man was our son-in-law. That's how serious it was. And it ended pretty quickly, mainly because they moved physically to 2 different places. She left school, he was still at school. The distance thing was a big challenge, right? But on the night that everything is going down and everything's hitting the fan, she's obviously beside herself, inconsolable, right? So my wife and I are here in her room, just being there for her. Word has already gotten out on social media, right? So her phone is blowing up. And what I found interesting and frustrating at the same time, that's a challenge, to be interested and frustrated at the same time, because I was ready to walk out of the room, was that while we were there for her and trying to be present with her, she was constantly attending to what was happening on her phone. So focusing on one thing isn't easy, but I think is effective, especially as it relates to listening. And ignore the phone, right? Because if you're talking to somebody and they start looking at their phone, what do you think right away? Right? They're not completely engaged with me. Now, maybe that thing that's happening on the phone is very important, right? So that kind of leads to the third one. It's not for me to judge, right? I don't want to, as I'm listening to somebody, I don't want to judge what they say or judge what they do. But, you know, the phone thing, I don't know, we've kind of got new values around that now. I mean, it used to be, people would be surveyed and asked, when's like the most inappropriate time that people should be on their phones? And, you know, people would say, you know, in restaurants. And then you go to the restaurant and everybody's on their phone, right? So it's like we kind of know that this isn't really great to do, but yet we're addicted or we feel compelled or whatever the reasons are, which again, an effective listener, again, is going to focus, they're going to put their own phone away, and no judgment to what you're hearing or experiencing. Because obviously once you start to demonstrate judgment, and remember, you can demonstrate judgment in your facial expressions, right? I mean, somebody could be telling something and you crinkle up your face a certain way and they take that to mean, oh, or you think this about it, right? So it's, a good listener is trying to be neutral, I'm just listening. I'm gathering information, gathering expertise. Okay, so in addition to listening, here's my other suggestion for developing expertise. I like this phrase, diversity of thought. It means to surround yourself with opinions and ideas and attitudes that aren't the same as yours. We don't tend to do this naturally because it's uncomfortable. When you get together with your family at the holidays, are there any subjects that are kind of off limits? Because if we talk about these things, you know, it's going to ruin my meal, I'm going to get indigestion. I mean, it'd be great if everybody could say, oh, no, that never happens. We could talk about anything. But that's not usually the case, right? I didn't really know my father for most of my life, which is a good thing because he was an alcoholic and, you know, didn't get sober until early 40s. And that's actually when he and I kind of got reacquainted. And so I kind of had the best years of his life in my life. And then he passed away pretty early in his early 60s. But the one thing I admired about my dad was that you could talk about anything. There was not a single thing that would create any tension or animosity or judgment. And so at his memorial, which was at his home, you know, all their friends and family and everybody coming in to just celebrate his life, you know, I spoke for a couple of minutes at the beginning and basically encouraged people, talk about all the stuff you never talk about, right? Let's talk about sex, let's talk about politics, let's talk about all the things that nobody tends to talk about because, and obviously I was, you know, doing this to lighten the mood. I wasn't really hoping people would talk about sex, but whatever, right? Exposing yourself to other points of view will refine and hone your expertise, right? But it's uncomfortable to watch that cable news show that drives me crazy or listen to that talk radio show that gets on my nerves. So don't do it so long that, you know, you become maniacal, but just expose yourself to the ideas. All right, so a few more ideas now on communicating expertise. We talked a little bit about developing expertise, but how about actually communicating this expertise? I've got a few ideas for you here. Don't just communicate what, but communicate why. Think about as a kid when you were told to do something and you questioned why and you got a response because I told you so. Ooh, that doesn't sit well. Really doesn't sit well when you're an adult and somebody tells you that. I want to know why. I mean, kids want to know why, but adults really want to know why. And the millennial generation that's, you know, quickly building the workforce, right? The workforce of tomorrow will be that generation, and it's not tomorrow, it's actually just a few years away. They want to know why. So we need to be able to express not just a what, but a why. I also think it's important to relate a lot of things to your own personal experience. I mean, I'm doing that obviously quite a bit this morning. But I would even do that if I was talking to you about reviewing appraisals or analyzing tax returns or some technical operational mortgage topic. I would still be relating a lot of what I'm sharing to experiences that I've had. And rather than, even though I said earlier, you know, the picking a lane thing is important, you also want to be able to, instead of saying either or but, because so many people will at least feel intuitively that once you say the word but, that everything after that, you know, is basically nonsense. Love the job you did on that loan, but love the job you did on that loan, and then you can go into your criticism, if you have a criticism, for instance, right? Not either an or the word but. I try to eliminate that word almost entirely, and instead say and. So I'm thinking about cooperation, competition. I really think it's both, right? Yet I have to craft an essay. If I want to enter this event, I have to craft an essay that picks a side. So I tried to kind of combine them, being clever. Coopetition, how about that, right? Which isn't really what they're asking for, but what I'm saying is that sometimes it actually is both, right? Everything isn't black and white. Everything isn't about picking a lane. I'm encouraging you to develop that habit and that skill, build that muscle of picking a lane, but there will be times in life when it's not a lane, it's a both, right? There's lots of examples in the world of sports. You know, I think this was taken from you know, track meet when one of the competitors fell down, and rather than the person that was leading, finishing the race, stopped and, you know, picked up her competitor, and they used cooperation to get across the finish line together. So coopetition is just a play on words of cooperation and competition, but it's also an example of kind of the and, not the either, the or, and the but and. So which lane did I pick? Well, this was not easy. I kind of made a list of all the reasons why I thought competition and all the reasons why I thought cooperation. I literally drew a line down the center of a piece of paper. These are the reasons for competition. These are the reasons for cooperation. I counted them, and they were exactly the same on both sides in number. So counting by number is not going to do it. So I started thinking about experiences, and I had to go all the way back to kindergarten. One of my first memories as a child was in kindergarten. And apparently, I was kind of aggressive when it came to picking toys out and the language that I chose to use. And at this particular kindergarten, if you misbehaved, they took you into the bathroom, and you had to take a nice big bite out of a bar of ivory soap and chew it. You didn't have to swallow it, but you had to chew it, spit it out. And my mom would come to pick me up at the end of the day, and my mouth would be all raw, and tears would be streaming down my face. Needless to say, she took me out of that kindergarten. But I did learn a valuable lesson. Didn't know it at the time, right? But I learned a valuable lesson looking back, that being competitive had a certain downside that cooperation wouldn't have. So let me talk about a couple of key points we've covered so far. Think before you communicate, right? Avoid that tendency to procrastinate. The 3 E's, right? Expertise, eloquence, engagement. Just stated another way, have something worthwhile to say it well, involve your listener, your reader. And you don't have to chew ivory soap to know it doesn't taste good, right? Many of you in the room have probably never chewed ivory soap, and yet you might have been realizing it doesn't taste good, right? So you don't have to have your own expertise to be an expert, because you can borrow other people's experiences, right? By listening, right? By engaging in diversity of thought. You can use other people's experiences and knowledge of something to build your own. You don't have to completely do it all on your own. So I picked Elaine, and as I mentioned earlier, it was chosen as one of the 4 finalists. Great. Now what? Other than going to New York Mills, Minnesota, I have no idea what's next because I've never done anything like this in my entire life. So now I have to back it up. Verbally. I thought I'd written a pretty good essay. People I read my essay to thought, oh, they'll pick that one for sure. I didn't know what that meant. I mean, but I thought it was pretty good. But now to have to get up in front of a group in a state-of-the-art auditorium with hundreds of people and bright lights in your face and you can't see anybody and you're sweating and all that stuff that happens on the stage of even these presidential debates, how do I do that? How do I prove my point? How do I compete proving that cooperation is a more valuable thing for society?
Hopefully that wasn't one of the times your fly was open.
Well, I was standing behind one of these. They didn't really let you move around, so I don't know if that was a good thing or not, because actually moving tends to kind of, whoops, I hope I didn't mess up your webcam. Moving tends to kind of let the nerves dissipate a little bit, you know, so literally standing behind this thing, I mean, my legs are shaking, you know, and if my hands are shaking, I can do the death grip on here, you know, because I was horribly uncomfortable in that setting. I'd never done anything like that before. I was never in debate. I was never in theater. I never did anything that kind of put myself up on a stage other than music. I mean, I'd been a musician as part of an orchestra, but that's a different thing than kind of exposing yourself all by myself up there on stage. So horribly uncomfortable. But let's talk about eloquence now. Okay, we spent a little bit of time on expertise. Let's talk about eloquence. And you know, some things are just said so well. I mean, I could stay up all weekend and never come up with something like this, right? So it's okay to borrow, right? When you have a point to make and somebody else has figured out how to make it really well, borrow it. I mean, give attribution if you know who said it. A lot of quotes that are flying around out there right now, you know, you go on the internet, and, oh, this person said it, no, this person said it. I mean, sometimes it's actually hard to figure out who originally said it. But, you know, I'm not suggesting that we steal people's words and make them as if they're our words, but by all means, you know, borrow. You know, one of the greatest communicators probably of all time. And I don't know who said this, but this is a quote as well. I just don't know who said it. I think it comes from like the 14th century in India somewhere. And I am very mindful of this last part. You know, is what I'm saying improving on the silence? Is what I'm writing, is what I'm texting, is what I'm emailing, is that an improvement on basically nothing? Because if it's not, then I shouldn't even do it. So I'm thinking to myself all the time, is this better than silence? So in the first round of the debate, you're actually debating the person that chose the same side you chose. So not only did I not know how to debate, I really don't know how to debate someone who thinks the same way I think. But they do that so that the audience can say, oh, on that side of the question, that person makes the most compelling case. And then they'll do that with the other side of the question, those two people, pick the best one of those two, and then those two winners meet in a final debate to really debate the question. And as I said, I'm horribly uncomfortable, could not wait for it to be over, could absolutely not wait for it to be over, which is unusual for me. I enjoy presenting. But again, I'm really a trainer more than anything else. This is something different from training. So I realized I had a lack of confidence. And part of my lack of confidence was I was paying attention to who the other finalists were. One had been there before. had already been a finalist a few years before and was back a second time. So she knew exactly what was happening, what to expect, how it all worked. Another person was in her second career going to law school. The third person was a professor of English composition at the University of Minnesota. And then there's the CMG training guy.
That's impressive.
Yeah. That's quite a resume.
Quite the build-up. Quite the build-up.
Quite a resume. But you know, a lot of that is self-imposed limitations, self-imposed criticism. But I was realizing in that first round that part of my problem here is that I'm not confident. I'm uncomfortable, absolutely. I'm out of my element, absolutely. But I'm also suffering from a lack of confidence. And I'm looking at these other people and I'm saying to myself, I don't measure up to them. I'm sure you can relate to this. I'm not good enough. Why am I here? Yes, maybe I wrote a good essay, but writing is different than speaking. And all these thoughts are going through my mind. So as a result of that experience, again, this is all hindsight now, looking back, here are some suggestions on saying it well and being eloquent, especially in situations where maybe it's not comfortable. 3 C's, I've just mentioned the first one. We don't want to come across as being arrogant. And actually, I have to sometimes be mindful of that. You know, I'm not often videotaped, but when I am videotaped, I'm able to actually see myself presenting, as painful as it is to watch yourself doing something, because we're very critical of ourselves. Oh, I can't believe I look like that. I can't believe I sound like that. I can't believe I do that with my hands. I can't. But that's the best feedback you'll ever get, because nobody's going to give you that kind of feedback. One of the things that I will occasionally notice is that I might come across as being too confident or a little arrogant, which is never my intent. But that's good to know that, oh, you know what? Sometimes I come across that way. And I have to think about that when I'm trying to persuade someone or working with my child on something that's very difficult, or that I'm not coming across as, you know, arrogant, because I know that I have that tendency. I don't mean it. It's not really what I'm trying to do, but I could come across that way. So you do want to be confident in your communication, but not arrogant. And especially today, less is more. I mean, you need to say enough to be complete. You know, my wife spent, you know, most of her adulthood basically raising our children. And she's recently decided that she wants to, you know, work some and earn some income and just get out and be with adults. Because really, now that the kids are kind of getting off on their own, her other world is taking care of elders. Her parents, my grandmother, she spends a good chunk of her life in their world. And it drives her a little batty sometimes. You know, it's like, I need to get away from all the old people, right? And just get with other people, right? But it was interesting. She was just telling me last night that she was on this job interview where they had asked her and all the applicants to, like, compose something, you know, write something. And she said that the person that was interviewing told her that many of the people that were coming in to apply, when they would type something, they were basically texting. So the way they were writing was the way that they text, because that's what they know, right? And I can remember when texting first started to kind of like be a thing, that my son, who's a couple of years older than our daughter, and he's very, you know, he was like the student, right? So he's kind of very, it's important to him that, you know, you like do things correctly. And he was just up in arms about how much this texting he thought would affect people's ability to actually write, because they would blur the lines and not realize, oh, this is like an email to my manager, right? So I don't need to be cute and clever with, you know, my little emojis and all that kind of stuff, right? There's a time for that, and there's a time not for that, right? So, but concise, regardless of how you do it, you know, concise I think is important. As few words as possible. I have this theory, I call it the half dozen theory. There's only about a half dozen things that you really have to know to make any kind of a decision or to take any kind of an action. It's all going to come down to no more than about a half a dozen key concepts. I mean, look at a loan file, for instance. Yeah, there's dozens of factors that go into whether they get a yes or a no, but isn't it going to come down to no more than about a half dozen? I mean, that's really what's going to drive the decision. So that helps me think as I'm communicating, and I don't need to give them everything. I need to just give them no more than the half dozen. And as conversational as possible. Now, I suppose you have to know the setting. There might be some business environments where that's not appropriate, but more and more, that's the direction we're moving in, isn't it? I mean, from dress to our presentations to our written communications, I mean, we're becoming more and more casual and conversational all the time. And certainly what you're experiencing this morning, this is not a presentation. This is a conversation. And I expect that you feel as if I'm having a conversation with you. This is not scripted. I mean, I have a few notes because I'll forget things and I want to make sure I touch stuff that's important, but there's no script here. You know, the company, Arch, actually is struggling with this, my style a little bit because, you know, they want to know, like, well, what is it that you tell people when you're talking about? And I'm like, just, you have to trust that it's not going to be anything that, you know, you're going to get in trouble for. It's not going to, I'm not going to put the company in liability, and I'm not going to do anything inappropriate. But for me to sit down and write out every word that I've said with you this morning would not only be a really time-consuming process, but the next time I give this presentation, I won't be giving it the same way. Because that's just not the way that I communicate. I communicate in a very conversational style. But I'm recommending that we all do that. Okay, so here are some eloquence tips. If you want to say it well, sometimes you just have to give some intention to that preparation. I came to that debate with 50 talking points. So a week before the event, they released the 4 essays for general consumption. So now I get to read what the other 3 finalists said. And so not only did I have my own points I wanted to make, but now I knew what their points were, and so I tried to figure out how to address their points, and so I had on stage with me on little note cards, literally 50 just talking points, just, oh, you could use this, you could use this. Now, by the way, I only ended up using like 2 because I didn't even understand these questions. They were so intellectual, and I mean, I have a decent vocabulary, but these, I'm like, is there a dictionary up here? Or a thesaurus I can use? It's one of those things where you're up there saying, please ask the other person first, so that in their answer, I can figure out what your question was, right? In fact, it was recorded. At that time, they used to actually, well, it's broadcast live on some local radio station as it takes place. And then they record the event, and my year was the first year that they actually stuck it on their website. So I have a recording of the event. I have not listened to it until this past week when I was traveling, and I was actually in Wisconsin earlier in the week driving for hours and hours, and I thought, you know what, I've got a CD of the Think Off, I'm just going to listen to it. And it was the first time I'd heard it since I'd been there. And I still didn't understand the question. I mean, really, I'm like, how would I have answered that, right? So my talking points, the preparation, I still would have said, yes, you should prepare, you should be ready, but you also know that in the real world, the meeting doesn't go as planned. This conversation is heading in a different direction I didn't anticipate. So it's a balance between the preparation and the let's be conversational, right? There has to be kind of that balance there in reality, especially in business, right? The other thing that I did in the way of preparation is I crafted my closing arguments ahead of time. So for the first round, when I'm debating the person who's on my side, I'd already written out what I want to say at the end. And then, just being a positive thinker, if I were to get to the second round, what would I want to say at the end of that one? And I had those ready. Nobody else did that. So at the very end, now the very end of each round is when the people are going to go vote. So at the very end, I did not want that to be some rambling of thoughts. I wanted that to be, hey, this is my takeaway for you on what I really believe about this side of the topic, and I want that to be what you walk away with and is in your head when you go vote. And nobody else did that. They took it more casually. They just kind of did their own summary. So I give them credit for doing that on the fly, but I didn't want to do that. And back to the expertise thing, right? When we know what people have quickly run out of things to say, don't engage in communication when you can't say much, right? You want to be saying and communicating only the tip of what's possible. That way, if questions come or the conversation goes off in another direction, it's not a big deal because you've got this whole well that you can pull from and bring into the conversation. Because all you were planning on sharing was just, this little bit, and yet underneath the surface, you've got all this knowledge and experience. And as painful as it is, I do believe for us to get better, we have to get feedback. The surveys that you might do on the presenters at the CUREN meetings, that's a certain kind of feedback. As a presenter, me personally, I don't know how much that would help me improve because the questions are probably not geared towards how could I improve, right? The questions are geared toward, did you get something out of the presentation? Would you want that speaker back? That kind of thing. So I'm a big believer in getting feedback. In fact, I was in Toastmasters for a lot of years, and really the only reason I was in Toastmasters is because I wanted to present to people who would give me feedback. Because you're not an audience who's typically going to give me that kind of feedback, right? You'll give me a different kind of feedback. So my mother and sister had come to this event. They lived in Wisconsin at the time. They drove up to New York Mills, Minnesota to cheer me on. They're sitting in the front row. The first round is over. Oh, thankfully, now I can finally relax a little bit. Everybody's doing their voting thing. My sister comes up to me to give me some feedback. She says, wow, that was really tough. I wasn't sure who to vote for. Those were her words to me. I'm like, are you seriously telling me this, right? Keep it to yourself, right? I really needed that for my confidence right now. So I'm thinking to myself, well, hopefully my mother voted for me, and they at least offset each other, right? But that was valuable feedback. So I'm kind of putting you on the spot here, but in terms of expertise or eloquence, because those are really the only two, we haven't gotten into engagement yet. So expertise and eloquence. What have you seen or experienced in this presentation that would be an example of that, of demonstrating expertise or eloquence? So give me your impressions. What have I done that has shown that? Because I'm not only trying to tell you this stuff, I'm trying to model it, right? So
what is the basis for your thoughts and how you came up with your reasoning for doing your presentation? Which side of that?
So like background?
Yeah, background, provided good background.
Context? Okay. All right, what else?
From an expertise standpoint, I like your personal experiences because I think communication applies to every one of us. And when you show us the personal experience, most of us can relate to that. So I like that part of it.
Okay. All right, good. Others?
Another thing I noticed is, it's one thing to have a slide up or to have a comment or a quote, but you're able to show it and then kind of take it to, well, this is what that means, and this is why it means that, so that you can. So you kind of take a point and push it all the way through so you can show the effective value. That's, I think, an expertise is.
Okay, I like that. I like that. That helps me put things together in the way that you just said that you thought I was putting it together. Anything else? We're not used to getting or giving that kind of feedback. And yet if you really want to be more eloquent, if you really want to be a better communicator, it is kind of important that we get some feedback. It's not just about presenting often. You'll get better at anything if you do it often. But to really become skilled at something, you've got to get I don't want to say a coach, because I think multiple opinions are far better than just one person helping you out. But you need to get some sort of feedback, because the feedback is what's going to help you do it differently another time.
Well, I don't think there's anyone in here that can't wait to find out how the story ends.
Okay.
So I think you have a
But I'm not telling you that until I get back to Marco Island. I want to be at Marco Island next year. My wife and I had a great time there. All right. So I'll give you one piece of that right now. So the first round ends. I'm finally able to relax a little bit and wipe all the sweat off myself. And my sister gives me that great feedback. And I did win the first round. So they did, how they made that choice. I'm listening to like I said, I'm listening to this over the past week. I'm listening to the other person. I actually thought the other person did a better job of answering questions. So I don't know if it was the what I said that just resonated with people, or if it was something about my demeanor. I really have no idea. But just listening to the audio, not seeing what's happening on stage, but just listening to the audio, I really thought she was much better at grasping what the question meant. This was the lady going to law school, by the way. So I mean, she's smart and able to think on her feet. I'm more thoughtful. So this whole kind of I got to come up with something quickly to say was a real challenge for me, because I like to sit with something a little bit before I speak. And you're not able to do that in this kind of a situation. And we all have those times where sometimes we can be thoughtful about it, and other times, no, we've got to think either on our feet or in your seat, right? I mean, you've got to have something to say quickly, and I actually thought she did a better job of that than I did. But however they chose me. Okay, so again, expertise. Having something worthwhile to say. We talked a little bit about how that's primarily, especially in this event, but even just in general, it's about being able to pick a lane. Here's what I believe. Here's what I think. We talked a little bit about eloquence. That was saying it well, right? Being able to back up what you believe and think. So that kind of leads us to engagement. To me, engagement requires a third skill. So first would be back it up, or first would be pick a lane, second would be back it up, third would be appreciating the other side. You know, those are two different views and perspectives of a fish, right? So not everyone is going to agree with you or like what you have to say. How willing are we to not just listen, but to truly appreciate the other perspective? I mean, on a loan, right? I mean, keep bringing this to mortgage lending if you want. One person thinks a file should be approved, another person feels a file should be declined. Both of those views have merit. Both of those views are significant. Now, ultimately, we have to pick a lane, but if I'm on one side, I shouldn't just dig my heels in on that side and say, well, no, it's all about what I think. Share with me why it is that you see it the other way. The goal here is not to change your mind, right? The goal here is not to convince someone to your point of view. The goal here is to address the issue more thoroughly. And that's what a debate is supposed to do. Now, what you're going to see in the presidential debates coming up, they aren't debates. They're performances. They're people who aren't even answering the questions they're being asked because they have their own agenda that they want to put out there. And it's more about tearing other people down than it is about building themselves up. Because most of them, usually what I experience in these debates is that most of them don't have a whole lot to say about how great they are, so instead they say how terrible everybody else is. So there's two ways to have the tallest building in town. You can either build the tallest building, or you can tear everybody else's down, right? And then you've got the tallest building. And I think in politics a lot of times it's about tearing the other buildings down, and all of a sudden mine is now the tallest building. So I will watch those debates intently because I'm a student of communication and I'm very interested in seeing how people communicate, but I am not interested in kind of the debate itself or even necessarily what's being said, because it's not really a true debate. A true debate gets at the heart of an issue, right? That's where the willingness to appreciate another point of view becomes important. So again, just to summarize those three steps. And I really think this has a lot of applicability to our business, right? Because every single day we have to pick lanes, we have to back it up, and we also have to appreciate the other point of view. Now, unfortunately, we've got a lot of poor examples of engagement. Because apparently, what the media has decided is engaging is what I would call argumentative. So let's put two, quote, experts on a panel and let's just let them argue with each other. Who can shout over the other one? Who can interrupt the other one more often? I mean, that's what I see more often. Now, maybe I don't really watch a lot of television, so maybe you guys have found some things that are better than what I'm talking about. But mostly what I see is not real engagement. It's about pontificating on your point of view at the expense of another person's point of view, as opposed to let's really get to the heart of the issue and help the people, the viewers, the listeners, get to the heart of an issue. The first time, you know, I wasn't really that interested in politics as a younger person, right? As a lot of younger people aren't, right? But the first time I remember being really kind of confused and upset about this issue, I guess it would have been back when maybe Gore and Bush were running. And they were debating about, I think it had to do with like the future of Social Security. And both of them took the same information, like the same facts, yet had completely different, this is what that means. And I'm sitting there as a viewer thinking, I need help in understanding this, and that's what I was hoping this debate would do, is help me understand this big, complex financial issue, but I'm not getting that because both of you are agreeing that the facts are this, but then one of you is saying, and that means this, and the other is saying, no, 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 it means that. And they were so completely different views, I was left confused, not understanding, well, I don't know what any of that means anymore. Right? What I felt like is that somebody's lying. It might not have been that, it might have been the way that facts are interpreted, but I don't find that engaging. I just don't find that engaging. So, there is a difference between opinion and expertise, and I think a lot of what we see out there is opinion. So to really have expertise, you know, consider, have you done it? Have you done it well? What are the results? Now, I realize we don't always communicate about things that we've got all this great expertise and results in, but it certainly can be more effective if we do. Opinions are easy. Everybody's got one, right? Okay, so some other ideas on eloquence. Authenticity, being present. I've strived, is that the right word? Striven? I don't know. My wife would correct me. Whatever it is, she would know. Grammar's not always my best subject. I have tried as much as possible while presenting to be here, to be present. That's not always easy because I'm thinking about what I'm going to say and I'm watching time and I'm looking at notes. But authenticity goes a long way towards being eloquent. Just being yourself. You really don't have anybody else to bring anyway, right? And there's nothing wrong with using emotion. I'm not talking about visibly breaking down and in one of my earliest Toastmaster speech contests, I thought I had a really, really good speech. But the person that beat me kind of broke down on stage. But in a way that it affected the audience and the judges at a very deep level, because that's what emotion does. You know, it kind of connects at the heart level, not the head level. So my speech was great at the head level, but it didn't get to people's hearts. This person was able to get to people's hearts and probably deserves to win, right? Emotion is the express lane of the brain is actually a phrase used by a gentleman named Doug Stevenson, who's a big storytelling coach, helps speakers in particular craft stories. So I took that to heart and I used what I thought was some emotion. Now, I'm not a very emotive person. You know, I'm not going to be jumping up and down and pumping fists and crying, and that's just not me. It's not my style. But I tried to use things in what I said that would have an emotional impact on people. So just some examples. In my final closing argument, I talked about JFK. Now, I had done some research to know what the demographics of that audience was going to be. And I figured, the JFK reference would have some meaning to people that were there. And I specifically used the words. Remember, did I tell you what I chose? Yeah, I chose cooperation, right? So I said that in his inaugural address, he said that, united, there's nothing that we cannot do. Divided, there's nothing we can do, right? And I used that quote to illustrate that cooperation was a higher value than competition, right? But I knew that bringing up JFK would probably resonate with people. I talked about how competition brings out the beast in us, but cooperation brings out the best in us. Again, that had kind of like an emotional beast in us. People immediately can start to think of, oh yeah, I've seen these crazed parents on the sidelines going nuts, and it's like immediately you can kind of know what that's about. And ultimately, ultimately in my final argument, I said that I equated the word cooperation with love, with the emotion of love. That to be cooperative, to cooperate, is a loving thing to do. And that if the debate is over, we should be loving or not loving, there's no debate. That's emotion. Right? I didn't do any of that to be gimmicky. These were all kind of heartfelt, sincere things that I wanted to share. But again, looking back, I realized, oh, I was using kind of like emotional touch points that might make a difference. Also, if you can tell things in stories, I mean, I've woven into this presentation this particular think-off experience. All these numbers that we deal with and facts that we deal with, there are stories behind those numbers and facts. There are people. If we express things from the human perspective and in story mode, not once upon a time kind of story, all the facts and figures and statistics and all of those things that we talk about and share so much in our industry can really be much more compelling if we relate it to the human story part of it. All right, another quick recap. 3 more key points. Well-timed silence can be more eloquent than speech. Arguing shows ignorance, debate shows knowledge. That's my personal opinion. We're not very intelligent when we argue, usually. We say all kinds of really crazy stuff. The perfect balance, is an organized conversation. I was using that phrase, organized conversation, for years, and then some people that I know, that I've become acquainted with, I actually do a little bit of freelance work with them once in a while. Arch knows, it's not a secret, so you don't have to keep it in the room. They wrote a book called The Orderly Conversation. You might want to check it out. The Orderly Conversation. And it's about business presenting, meetings, employee reviews, I mean, however you want to put business presenting in a context. But it's about that balance between it needs to be orderly and organized, but it also has to be conversational and spontaneous, because that's what happens in a business meeting. I mean, my presentation for the most part today is one way. But in most presentations that many of us make, that's not how they are. It's two-way. You can't have a whole carefully crafted thing if it's going to be a two-way, because it'll take its own direction and go off track. And so The Orderly Conversation is a book that tries to help people with that business reality of, we think of presentations as I'm going to tell you something, but in reality, it's more of a give and take. It's a conversation. And how do we get good at both? How do we be organized, but how do we also be conversational? Okay, in the spirit of over-delivering, 3 more things. Only 13 more months until what? The election. So I told you I'd like to watch the debates, not for the content, but for the communication. But one of the things that will become very important for whoever rises to the top, and ultimately whoever wins the election, is this next point. You need to be congruent. You need to be and live what you say and communicate. Now, I realize that who you are at home might be slightly different than who you are at work, or the ways in which you communicate certain things. That's not an incongruency. That's just different modes of your life that are kind of dealt with in different ways. But ultimately, that's what people respond to, is congruency. So your message, how you communicate, what you communicate, it needs to be you. And it never is about you. Any communication, written, verbal, it really should never be about you. It should be about the recipient of that communication. If we're mindful that that's the intended benefactor of what we're doing, it takes the pressure off, first of all. Because if it's not about me, I don't have to worry if my fly's open, right? Because it's not about me, right? So in that second round, I went from uncomfortable to comfortable. First round I didn't want to end. Second round I couldn't, no, first round I wanted to end. Second round I didn't want it to end. I thought we were really getting to the heart of the issue, which is what I thought this whole thing would be about. In the final round, I was up against the professor of English composition from the University of Minnesota. So not only is he kind of a local in a way, because he's from Minnesota, he's actually not from Minnesota, he's from New York City. He's the son of Italian immigrants who misread the instructions and thought that this would be held in New York, not New York Mills. So he entered thinking he could get a trip to New York City, not just a trip upstate from where he lived, but this guy was a character. He wrote the essay in like 20 minutes. Like he just sat down and he just wrote it. I spent weeks crafting my essay. I spent weeks with the question in my head, first of all. Then I spent weeks crafting the essay and sharing it with people and refining it and changing it, and sit down in 20 minutes and you get picked as a finalist, right? Like, please. And then he just had this way about him. I didn't even realize how much until I was just listening to the recording. People are laughing. I mean, he's a character. He's a nut. You know, we all kind of had to take a picture to send of ourselves, you know, for their brochure. He took a picture like holding his cat, you know, like who does that, right? He had this goofy way about him that was just endearing to people. So, and he would, I mean, he talk about thinking on your feet. He thought so much on his feet. I mean, there was no preparation. So he'd go completely off track, but then just say, you know, I don't know where this was going. And everybody'd laugh and think this was, and I'm, you know, I'm sitting there with my 50 talking points, like, there should be points against that, right? Like, he doesn't know where this is going, right? I've got 50 talking points. Totally, completely different styles. But what I did do in the second round was I became more comfortable. I just decided in the second round to be myself. So yeah, the CMG training guy was just going to do what he normally does, which is get up in front of a group of people, share some ideas, try to connect, hope to make a difference. Even though I couldn't see people, I pretended that I could, right? I even had them engage in some kind of goofy physical exercise in their chairs to demonstrate a point that I was making. I mean, I used what I would call a couple of gimmicks, which were, in my mind at the time, just an attempt to be memorable, an attempt to do something a little different. But again, listening back to the tape, I'm like, how would they decide? And they're not supposed to decide for who they agree with. They're supposed to decide for who makes the best case. And again, this guy, Angelo, did a really, really good job. So the only thing that I can explain as to what happened is that in the final argument, I talked about how I made that reference to cooperation equating to love. Because Angelo told me afterwards that as soon as I said that, it was over. Because who's going to argue against love? Who's going to say, oh, no, love doesn't matter. Love's not important. Now, I have no idea how close the voting was. I would assume it was probably very close. But I did win. So there you go. I got my 15 minutes of fame. You know, the town throws a big party. Everybody stays up all night and goes from like house to house. I mean, it's like this really big deal. You know? The weird thing about it is that the community, this little rural community, they treat the four finalists as if we're like some sort of gods or something. You know, and I was really trying to let them, you know, make them realize, folks, we are no different than anybody here. Anybody can enter this event. Anybody that has an opinion on the question of the year can pick a lane and back it up, and if they're lucky enough to be a finalist, you know, engage an audience and try to show some eloquence and see what happens. The people that go there are ordinary, everyday people. We are not anything special. So the community thinks, oh my God, it's like these four brilliant minds are coming into town, and that's not the case. So I've written an essay probably half the years since then, I won't take the time to do that if the question doesn't matter to me. You know, one year the question was, does poetry matter? And it doesn't matter to me. And that's all I've got. Right? It'd be a really short debate, right? Another year, they had to re-ask the question that was asked the very first year. The very first year was like back in the mid-90s. And the question they asked that year was if human beings are inherently good or evil. And I wrestled with that for a long time, trying to figure out, like, what do I think? What lane? And I ultimately came to a conclusion, which was that I thought we were inherently good. But I didn't know how to express that. I didn't know how to back it up. I didn't know how to, in other words, because it was like a feeling. I just had this feeling that we're inherently good. That's a really short essay too, you know? So I didn't write the essay. But you know the person that won that year said that we're inherently evil. So wouldn't it be fascinating? Because they post these 4 essays, like going back years and years, on their website, which is thinkoff.org, by the way. Wouldn't it be fascinating if you thought that we were inherently good and this person won the think off saying inherently evil? That's the 3rd step, right? Being willing to appreciate another point of view. Wouldn't it be fascinating to read what they had to say? I mean, you can't listen to the debate. They don't post the debates online anymore. But just reading their essay, just what were their points? How did they come up with that conclusion? That would be fascinating. It may not change my mind, but it expands my thinking, which gets back to diversity of thought. That's why this event has had such an impact on me, because it's about ordinary people expressing sometimes views on some very important topics. I mean, some of them have been things like, you know, what's more important, safety or freedom? Wow. And I answered that one right after I'd taken a trip to Washington, D.C. with my family, and we were standing at the steps of the Capitol, and there was this woman with her children and a family of people, and the child went running off like children do, and so the woman goes running off after her child. Well, she left her stroller there for like 2 seconds, and these guys with big guns like came out of the trees. You know, I mean, now at that particular time, I think there was some sort of a thing about maybe there was going to be a hit on the Capitol, or I mean, there was a heightened level of security. It's back when we had all those colors, remember the colors? And we were at whatever color wasn't very good, but not horrible. See, nobody could even remember the colors, right? But that just watching that take place, it was like, where do we live, right? My first feeling was, are we in a police state? Or are we in the land of the free? Like, what's happening here, right? And so that helped fuel my thinking toward the view that I took on that particular question. So it really is just about communicating life experiences and your own story. I've never been asked back as a finalist. They did call me on one year and said, we really, really liked your essay. We didn't pick it as one of the 4, but if one of the 4 can't make it, you know, would you come? It's like, well, if they're on the same side I am, right? And I gave this presentation once to a really unique audience. It was at a Mensa convention. So we're talking like really intelligent and very unique group of people, the Mensans. Right? And I'm giving a presentation, not this one, but I'm talking about the Think Off. So I'm thinking if there's a group that could appreciate an event like this, it'd be Mensa people, right? And they were so engaged in asking all these questions, and you could tell they were really thinking about this. And one of them asked something I'd never considered. They said, well, could you write an essay on both sides? Like, could you submit one for competition and submit another one for cooperation? And remember how when I made that list on a piece of paper, same on this side, same on that side, could I have effectively made an argument for the other side? I think I could have in writing, but I think once I got there, if I'd been chosen as a finalist, and let's say I'd been chosen on the side of competition, when it came to being eloquent and engaging with the audience, if I'm not all in, that's not going to work, right? So that's like another tip. It's not in the presentation, but you know, be all in. Because if you're not, people can sense that. I was all in on this. Again, I wasn't saying there was no need for cooperation. Angelo and I were not very far apart. Here's another big learning that came from that experience that has applicability to our world. He's on one side, I'm on the other side. So many times in politics, we think that the sides are this far apart. When we were up there debating, what we realized was that we're like that far apart. And I've had the benefit of traveling not only extensively in the United States, but internationally to some degree. And what I've learned is that we're not that different from each other. People from all over the planet, we think sometimes we're this far apart from each other, but when you really take a look at it, now those few things that separate us might be pretty significant things. Not downplaying that. We're not that far apart from each other. So it's a lot easier to connect with people when you realize that we're not that far apart. The yes and no on a loan is usually not that far apart on some loans, right? It kind of go either way, couldn't it? All right, one final tip. What do you see there? What do you see? Oh, you are technical, yeah. What's up there? What are those? Okay, what's another way of saying two? Paradigms. I know, kind of cheesy. That's a kind of a groaner. But a paradigm is a thought pattern. We have enormous opportunity, especially in leadership, to affect people's patterns of thought. It's an awesome responsibility, actually. And much of the way that we do that is communicating. Written, verbal, body language, all the ways that we communicate. And you know, because you've seen this before, that when you influence thoughts, that influences actions, which can influence outcomes. And so if your role in business is ultimately all about outcomes, it really has to go all the way back to what people are thinking, because that's what's going to influence what they do. So here's a quiz. What was the one thing? Remember?
Think before you speak.
Think before you speak. Thank you guys very much.
Wow, a lot of great information. I think I need to take some of these items back with me, I think. The couple of things that were said were like, oh my God, I think that's me. Oh gosh, I think I did that just yesterday. I sent an email I probably shouldn't have. I should have thought. It was late, 10 o'clock at night. I was mad. Ding, go. I'll have to think about that next time. We're going to take a 5-minute break, and then we'll reconvene for our next speaker.